Yo! What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Musician's Mentor podcast. I'm your host, Travis Mark, and today I have the amazing pleasure of speaking with the one and only Mitchell Player. Mitchell is an upright bass player here in New Orleans and one of the resident bass players at the world-famous Preservation Hall venue. He has played with jazz greats like Wallace Davenport, Leroy Jones, tons of the Marcellus family, including Wynton, Ellis, Jason, and Delphio. He has played with Phyllis Heyman, Brian Blade, Dick Heyman, Jermaine Basil, you name it. He's a real jazz cat, man. So if that's your bag, you got to listen to this episode. If it's not your bag, listen to this episode anyway, because his insight is incredible. As usual, please leave us a rating and review. We appreciate it. It helps us grow, helps us get found. But that's enough from me. Ladies and gentlemen, the one, the only, Mitchell Player.
Hello, this is Mitchell.
Hey Mitchell, it's Travis. How are you?
I'm doing great, Travis. Thank you. How are you today?
Very well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for giving us your time and for agreeing to do the podcast with us. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. What we're going to do is we're going to start how I start every episode, and that will be to get you to give a brief introduction as to who Mitchell Player is, please, sir.
All right, yeah. All right, well, again, yes, that's right. My name is Mitchell Player. So I've been a player all of my life. I'm originally from Shreveport, Louisiana. Grew up in Shreveport, but I'm currently residing in New Orleans, and I've been here since I think around 1994. And I'm an upright bass player. I started playing upright bass when I was 9 years old, public school orchestra. And it's kind of I always like to tell, it's a kind of a fun tale how I began playing, because, you know, I was in elementary school, and I'll never forget one of our teacher asked the class, like, you know, what kids, who of my kids are interested in playing a stringed instrument. And I threw my hand up because I thought I was going to get a chance to play like electric guitar. And then, you know, they brought us to the auditorium, and then, you know, of course, the string teacher was holding up violins and violas, and I was like really deflated when you know, so like it was pretty. I'll never forget that, you know, as a 9-year-old thinking you're gonna get to play guitar, and then, you know, they hold up a violin, so that was kind of out the box. So, you know, all the students in my class were like selecting their instruments, and I just kind of refused to like select one because I didn't see the electric guitar. And so we got down to the end, you know, I was like the last person in class, and my teacher said, well, I only have one instrument left. And I was like, okay, well, you know, what is that? You know, and she was like, well, follow me, you know. And never forget, I walked down the hallway in school, and she took me into this closet, you know, and opened up the closet door, and there was the string bass standing in the closet. And I was like, oh yeah, that's cool. I'll take that one, you know.
until you had to carry it.
Yeah. So, right. So then, of course, I am in New Orleans, so you might, and I'm outside, so you might hear a lot of that.
It's the sound of the city, baby.
Right. I didn't really, I hadn't really thought that through as a 9-year-old, that I was going to have to carry that thing around, you know. So, but that's how my journey began. And that was at Claiborne Magnet School in Shreveport, Louisiana. And I started doing that. And you know, my parents were very supportive, and went on to junior high school. Had a really great junior high school teacher that was very inspiring. Her name was Jeanette Parker LeBlanc, and she's my Facebook friend. She wrote me a very nice note yesterday, man, because I posted a link to a set that I just recently did with my band at the Jazz Museum. and she checked it out online. She's a Facebook friend of mine,
That's cool.
and after all these years, she kind of like keeps up still with my career, things that I post, etc.
Yeah.
And so I started. It was great with her. She exposed some of her students that were excelling. Even in junior high school, she would have a few of her students. It was like 3 or 4 of us. We would go over to Marshall, Texas, and actually play with the adult symphony over there.
Hmm.
And that was like a pretty mind blowing experience for me as a kid.
Of course.
And I'll never forget one of the because sometimes with the symphonies they would have different star artists that would come in and perform with the symphony. I never forget Floyd Kramer was one of the musicians that came and played with the symphony. I was able to play in the symphony with Floyd Kramer.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah. So it was, it was really cool times. And I got to high school, and in high school is where I joined. We had a stage band or jazz band in high school, and I don't know. So, actually, I went to my junior high school. For those that may know the jazz musicians that are out there, I was at the same junior high school with Brian Blade,
Oh,
and
cool.
we played together as kids and we're friends. And when I got to high school, he when we left junior high school, he went to Magnet High School. I went to Northwood High School, 2 different high schools, and so we kind of parted ways in terms of well, in regards to school. But we still, we play gigs and stuff together, a few gigs together, as kids around town. But I kind of started kind of getting into the jazz thing, kind of even, well, at least it was exposed to it a little bit in junior high school. I'll never forget, I was at Brian's house actually. And I'll never forget, man, I was at Brian's house and he had a stack of records on the couch in the living room. We would just like jamming. He was always really way advanced in terms of his musical knowledge as well as his abilities.
Mm.
And I remember looking at this John Coltrane record and thinking to myself, like, man, what the heck is this Brian's listening to? And I was telling him that one of the last times I saw him performing live, I was telling him I remembered when we were kids. I'll never forget, man. We were at his house, and Brian went to his bedroom, and he called me to his bedroom, and he was like, "Mitch, come back here. I want you to see something." And I walked down the hallway to his bedroom, and when I turned and to look into the bedroom, I never forget. Brian was in front of. You remember those little combo VCR TV sets that had? It was
Oh,
like
yeah.
a TV and VCR combined.
Yeah.
He had one of those things, and it was on top of his dresser. And he was watching this video with Joni Mitchell and Jaco Pastorius. I remember Joni Mitchell and Jaco Pastorius, and I just remember thinking, man, he thinks he's on stage playing with those people. He was so intensely in tune to that.
Wow.
And that struck me, and I never forgot that. And then all those years later, just just to know that he went. Of course, Jaco passed away, but he went on
Yeah.
to play with Joni and become good friends with her and stuff. But anyway, so it's just it's interesting, man. How our this musical life, kind of has all these twists and turns in it. So
Completely.
yeah, so I was in high school, got into jazz band in high school, had a great jazz band director for my first couple of years in high school, and I got more interested in jazz then, and we'll play around town, gigs in town with some of the adult bands that we had in town, and then from there I went on to Grambling State University, and I actually performed and went at that time. I actually performed with the marching band. I played electric bass on the sideline. They had what they call the sideline combo, where they would have keyboard players and electric bass players when the field show went on for the football games. They would roll us out when the band went out on the field. They would roll us out on the side, and we would play along with the band. That was pretty cool. So I got to travel with the band. I did that for a few years.
Cool.
And then decided, I was like, you know what, I want to move to New Orleans. Yeah. Yeah, I want to move, because Brian had already, that was one of the things too, because Brian, for us, it's Brian being a peer of ours, we were always kind of like following, because seemed like he was always way ahead, doing things. And he had already I think he'd gone to Loyola for a year or something. And he was in New Orleans, already in New Orleans playing. And that was like the talk, like, oh man, Blade's in New Orleans, he's playing. And so then it was, at that time, it was kind of like, yeah, I want to be this young, bebop player too. And I'm going to, move to New Orleans. But, yeah, my life direction kind of, had some twists and turns in it, as most of our lives do as musicians,
Yeah.
I got married early and started a family very early. I was like 21 with my first wife.
Wow.
And so we were very young and came to New Orleans, and it was very difficult. We divorced, but it was very difficult. We had a baby. We had a couple children actually, and considering this whole talk is about some of the challenges.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No. This is great.
So what happened was, it was kind of like, I just said, okay, it was like, well, we came to New Orleans. It was really a struggle, and at that time, it's like I didn't have any work. It was tough, and it's funny, man, because this was the '90s, so like mid '90s or something.
Mm.
So it was like, and that was a period for New Orleans when what we call the young lions came out of New Orleans. Like Nicholas Payton, Brian, of course, had already come and gone because he came down, and I remember he was working with Ellis, Jermaine Basil, then Ellis, and then I remember the word was I can't remember if he went first with Kenny Garrett or with Joshua Redmond.
Hmm.
But anyway, it was kind of like, oh man, what this is the way to do it. You come to New Orleans and hone your skills, and that was this coffee shop on Decatur Street. It no longer exists now. It's like a tourist program place or something now. But anyway, it was called Caldy's.
Okay.
Coffee shop. It's right by right behind where the Joan of Arc statue is there on Decatur.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where all the young guys at that time, we had our jam sessions, and I mean, they would go on for hours. And I mean, like, these guys were like super intense and super focused on, on the music, learning the music.
That's cool.
And and it was crazy, because it's, I remember, like I was saying with my first wife, I remember I would go and I'd stay at this thing for hours, right? My fingers would be bloody, and I come home with like $4, from tips. And we split up the tips, and it's like $4 or something. So that didn't go over too well at home. And also I think also at that time I was doing some symphony work too.
Oh, cool.
I forgot about that because I had when I was in high school and junior high school, I had, as I said, I started in public school orchestra, and I studied with Terry Pruitt. It was the principal bassist with the Shreveport Symphony at that time. And so I was some of those orchestra gigs that I got to play, like the pop, like the Shreveport Symphony, like on some of the Pops concerts and stuff like that. So that was all really good. And then when I came to New Orleans, I went to UNO for about a semester, and I was with the bass teacher that was here at the time, Graham Hamrick, I think was his name, if I remember correctly. The classical teacher. I started playing with the Baton Rouge Symphony, and then I would drive over and go to like with the Biloxi and the Mobile Symphony, kind of, it's kind of those orchestras.
Yeah.
And so I kind of did that, and I did that, and but then at the same time, I was also trying to like, do this whole like the jazz thing.
Yeah.
But it was such a struggle, man. And it was, to have a young family, and it was hard, and it wasn't good. So I'll never forget. My lutherer, the guy that works on my bass. His name is Salvador Jardina. It's always been the guy that I used. I went to a shop one day, and I was just, like, depressed, and I was like, man, I don't have any work, and everything that's going on at home, et cetera, et cetera. And he was like, well, you should call this guy Joe Simon. He's got tons of work for musicians, for young musicians. I was like, Joe Simon? Yeah, he says, yeah, call Joe Simon. He'll get you, you can get some gigs with Joe Simon. And somehow I got Mr. Simon's number, and I called him and started talking to him. And so Mr. Simon, he's deceased now, but he was one of the uh, people in the town that like he booked. He had several different musicians working for him at that time, and he would book all these kind of society engagements. He had like Commander's Palace and all the gigs at Commander's and Antoine's, and when they had the casino riverboats and the Natchez riverboat and the Creole Queen. I mean, he had all of these. So he'd send you out, he might have 4 or 5 different trios or quartets working at the same time.
That's cool.
So, I never forget when I first started talking to him, and he started asking me about, oh yeah, any traditional New Orleans songs, and saying, Basin Street Blues. I was like, yes, sir. Oh yeah, I know. I didn't know any of those. I had no clue what those songs even, sounded like. And but he was like, okay, so I started working for him, and then the older musicians, man, that was such a beautiful thing at that time. How the older musicians would take you under their wings, and they would really try to share and help you to learn. If you were a young musician,
yeah,
that seemed to really want to learn. So I'd have my fake book and a music stand that I would take to the gigs. If you can imagine that, and sit there like, okay, and they're called like, okay, well, whatever, Basin Street Blues or whatever, and I'm, I got to thumb through the fake book to get to the, to actually like, okay, hold up, and I remember one guy in particular, or a few guys like that, Pierre Poire, he's deceased also. He was a clarinetist here, and he was always very patient like that, would help me learn tunes. And then there was an older guy who's still actually a very good friend of mine. He's blind now. His name is Joe Cushenberry. He played banjo, and I would do and he also worked for Mr. Simon, and I would do these gigs with him at like Mr. B. In fact, he just started back to playing at Mr. B's Bistro on Sundays. That's his regular gig.
The restaurant on Royal, that Mr. B's.
Yeah, yeah, and he's just started back to doing that since COVID. And I used to, play a lot with him, and so it was kind of like, okay, I started kind of like learning these tunes, these New Orleans tunes, kind of, sort of. And then I got a gig with Wallace Davenport, and I don't know if you know Wallace but Wallace was a great New Orleans trumpeter, and he had a long-standing gig at the Maison Bourbon Jazz Club for years. That was one of the clubs they performed at regularly. And I was fortunate enough to get a gig with him, and these were all like old men. It was Wallace Davenport and Lawrence Cotton, who's a very good friend of mine. He's still living. We just celebrated his 96th birthday yesterday.
Wow.
And he's still playing. All the other guys are deceased now, but yeah. So I went to visit Mr. Cotton yesterday, but it was Lawrence Cotton and Wallace Davenport, Ralph Johnson, who was an amazing tenor clarinet player, and Joe Smith. They called him Joe Fox. He played drums, and I played with those guys for, I don't know, a couple of years at the Maison Bourbon until Wallace's health started, deteriorating,
Deteriorating.
declining, and um, that was great. That was such an experience. So then I started to like, because Wallace played with, oh man, in the stories, Wallace played in the Bassist band for years, played with Lionel Hampton. He recorded a lot with Errol Garner. He recorded with Sinatra. I mean,
Wow.
the list went on with him. And he had his, of course, his own thing. And so I learned a lot with those guys. That's when I was really, and Joe and Mr. Cotton, those two in particular, kind of took me under their wing, and kind of like father figures away, because I was away from home from my dad,
Yeah.
and so they took me on. And I mean, they groomed me, man.
That's cool, man.
And then I got a gig at Preservation Hall.
Yeah. We're going to talk about that. I
Yeah,
got some
and
Preservation Hall questions for you,
yeah. So
actually.
I'm just kind of blabbing. I guess I
No,
should
it's great. It's
stop
great.
it.
This gives our listeners and myself just a wider view of you. It's perfect. So it's like it doesn't
Yeah,
even matter that I've got certain things prepared and stuff, because already there's so many things to segue from here. The first thing I
yeah,
want to actually segue from here is the idea of the way it seemed to be at a point. Musicians, younger musicians would get involved with these bands with older musicians, as you said, and the older
yeah.
musicians would almost father figure / mentor these guys, pass the
That's
knowledge
right.
on, pass the stories on, pass the I call them gig survival tips. They'd pass these gig survival tips on. And I was talking to an elder guitarist a couple of weeks back, and we were talking about a very similar thing. And he was saying, or we were saying, shall I say, that seems to not be as free as it used to be. I don't know if we're just living in an age where there's lots of information available, so maybe people think you can just go find it yourself. But a lot of people
Yes,
don't seem to want to share. Maybe the term knowledge isn't the right word, but a lot of people don't
right,
seem to want to share that knowledge or give it so freely to these up and coming musicians anymore. At least that's what I'm
right,
seeing. Are you experiencing
right,
similar things?
right, right. Absolutely, we see that. It doesn't feel the same. Said like that. Gerald French and I were just talking about this very same thing, and he sent me a video with Christian McBride and Gregory Hutchison talking about the very same thing.
Huh.
And we were and yeah, it's different now. And Greg said something on that video that I thought was very interesting. He said something to the effect of that, to being into today's time of social media, and that having an effect on people think, kind of like, I mean, because I remember, man, like when I was first thought about or heard about like Ray Brown's, I'm like, man, YouTube didn't exist.
Yeah.
you know it was like, okay, and of course, as a kid, I didn't have much money, so you might get a one or two records or CDs, or or in fact, it was like cassette tapes during my day,
Yeah.
and check them out. But now it's like, you can just pull up YouTube, and you can look at all it. But I think, and that is great, but I think um when people think that they only, I don't know if I'm how to word this properly, but they can just simply rather just watching videos. I think it's no substitute for having a one-on-one relationship with a person.
Completely.
And I think that has had an effect on the types of relationships, and this, and as it relates to this, as it relates to this idea right now that we're discussing. I think that's played a significant role. Not to mention that, of course, there's not the same. I mean, when if you can imagine Bourbon Street having all jazz clubs on it.
Yeah.
What that day would have been like. Musicians. I remember the older guys talking about how they would have a gig at this club, or I remember sometimes might have a gig at this club for 5 hours, and then they go to the next club and do another 5 hours or whatever.
Hmm.
It was like that. There was so many musicians, um, and so much music, so much different music that could be heard, and people could be influenced by. That doesn't. None of that exists anymore.
No.
Hardly.
Yeah.
And Gerald was mentioning that to me the other day. He was like, we're the old guys now. It's like I can't even really imagine. Thinking about the conversations and the relationship that I had with the older guys, with Wallace and like I'm talking about Mr. Cotton. I don't have any relationships like that with any young people today. Now I have had a few to come, that say they're interested or whatever, and I try to help and steer people if I can. But it's different. I don't really even know how to, I don't know how what point to really to say about that. It's yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah, I
interesting
think on
part.
both sides.
Sorry about that. The
Yeah,
interesting part that I've always kind of dwelled on, not to the point of obsession or letting it get to me or anything, but they call it social media, but no
right.
one socializes. It's become
That's right.
it's become a platform for
That's
people
right.
to basically show the good parts of their life, and then
That's right.
people who I actually really feel sorry for some of the kids, and I'm
Yeah.
generalizing here, but it's like,
Yeah.
I look at some of the younger kids, and it's like, no wonder so many people have certain mental issues now. And I'm not saying that there
Right.
weren't mental issues back then, but you're living in this world of constant comparison. So it's
Right.
like, I
That's right.
hypothetically, I'm a young musician and I'm coming up and I decide, hey, I'm going to go on Instagram. And I go on Instagram, and I'm just using that platform as an example. But you go on there and suddenly you see that every other musician is doing a better gig than you, or has better
Right.
gear than you, or can play these cool things better than you. And I think what's happening is, and this is just my personal opinion, so any listeners don't blast me for this. I just think that people are comparing, and therefore either not following through on their own dreams or reaching such lower levels of insecurity that
Yeah.
maybe they just don't persevere in the way that they had hoped. And I hope that
Yeah.
eventually we find some kind of balance.
Right. Right.
Nonetheless,
No,
we're not gonna go down the social media train. I feel like I do that every now and then, and I don't want everybody to just think
yeah.
I'm anti-social media. I'm
Yeah.
not. I
No,
love social media.
yeah, no, I hear that, and I agree with you. You just had one other little thought I wanted to add to that after hearing you say what you just said was that one thing about New Orleans that was the unique what makes or made, I think, in a lot of ways, was just living on what the older days were like, but it made New Orleans so unique is the individualism. I mean, I remember kind of like I always think of it like it's like kind of like catching the tail end of it when I got here in the mid 90s, you know. And for example, I know this is going to sound crazy, but for example, like working at that Maison Bourbon Jazz Club, we would see all kinds of people. We had, I don't know if you ever, are you from here? Are you
No, I
familiar
moved here
with?
3 years ago.
Okay, so they had like Ruthie, the duck lady. And I don't know if you maybe you've heard of some stories about her.
No.
That was this late. That was this little old lady who she used to have. Now I met her. I saw her. She was years after the ducks, but you would even go around. They used to. I don't really see it that much anymore, but sometimes you'll go around and seeing like some of these art places where they have paintings or pictures and stuff. You might see a picture of her or different, but Ruthie the lady, she was kind of a little bit kind of wacky, got kind of out of her mind, but she had like a little pack of ducks that would follow her around the French Quarter.
That's cool.
And she was, yeah, and then they had this one guy that was he was dressed like Hulk Hogan. I always remember that guy that would walk up and down Bourbon Street, And then they had this one guy they called Chicken Man. He was like a voodoo guy that had like a voodoo. But my point that I guess that I'm trying to make is that, um, you know, there was such a uniqueness, individuality. You know, people
Yeah.
were very much individual. You know, in regards to what you said about the whole comparison thing, how with the social media thing, young people try to compare themselves, but everybody just wanted to be. If you talk to any of the older cats now, even if any of the older musicians you might run across, they're going to tell you, you should have your own sound. You should
Yeah.
have, I remember Mr. Cotton would always tell me, you play what and have your own sound. And I remember that drummer I was talking about, Joe Fox, he used to tell me, he used to say, man, Ray Brown can't make all the gigs. You know, it's like, a little funny thing like that. Those guys, they had, but they lived they lived life, man.
Yeah.
And the stories, they had those stories, and they were the people that they were because of the lives that they had, that they had lived and
I,
had experienced.
I love the stories. It's my favorite part of playing in
Yeah,
bands with older
yeah,
guys. It's like you just shut up and listen and you'll learn, you know?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So let's talk about the Preservation Hall. I know that you've
yeah,
got a regular gig
yeah,
there. I mean, that's probably the most famous and oldest jazz club in the world.
yeah,
Tell our listeners about what you feel is the importance of the venue, and also briefly tell us about how that gig came about for you.
yeah, yeah. So actually, I think, um, if I remember correctly, I was playing at the Maison Bourbon, and I believe I remember the creative director Ben Jaffe. Um, I remember seeing him standing outside. I was because if you on Bourbon Street, you can stand outside of Bourbon Street and look and see the stage at the Maison Bourbon. And I remember seeing him stand outside, like looking in. And I believe like on a break or something, and went out and talked to him, or we started talking to each other, and he just kind of like invited me down to the hall to come down and just like check out, what was going on down there. So, and it was kind of like not really on my radar at the time, to be honest. But then I started going down, and then I started listening. I'm like, wow, like listening to some of the cats, and um, I remember that was this bass player I used to love to listen to and then talk to on the breaks. His name was Richard Payne. And of course, there's Walter Payton, Nicholas's dad, was there, and Richard Payne. I remember there was a couple of bass players that I was like go and like listen to and get to talk and enjoy talking to. But yeah, so it was just kind of like just kind of checking it out. But then I got I don't know if I can't remember when it was, but I always remember when I remember. I don't remember when it was, but I remember the moment I started playing with Shannon Powell.
Oh, cool.
That was when this is after I had already like been here a few years and had been thought I had been playing and learning traditional jazz music. And man, from the first moment playing with Shannon, I was like, I'm thinking like, oh, okay, all right, now I understand now I understand
Hmm.
what this is supposed to be. So it was like that was like a transformative moment. Just my first experience playing with him, and and then of course, the venue playing in a room with all that old wood, and it's acoustic, and no amplification. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. Hmm.
No, man, fantastic place. And Shannon's a great player too. I mean, one
Oh
of one
man,
of the best.
Shannon's. Yeah, man. I mean, yeah, amazing.
So
Yeah.
let me pull it back a little bit and ask you possibly an interesting question. You've obviously been doing this for a very long time, and we spoke very briefly about your struggles when you moved to the city, trying to get gigs and staying at these jams for like $4 kind of thing. What advice could you give up and coming musicians on trying to get gigs? Let's say the situation, it's hypothetical. Some guy decides he's in the exact same boat you were. He wants to move to the city, or city, any musical city, and try
Hmm.
and make it as a working musician. Knowing
Hmm.
what you know now, what would your
Hmm.
approach be on trying to go get gigs or trying to get into the scene?
Okay, well, one of the first things I would do is now, knowing what I know now, is I would start studying with a prominent teacher who's already doing what I want to do. That'd be the first thing I do.
That's quite cool, actually.
Yeah, because what happens is if you're a good student, it's just a matter of time before your teacher's you're either subbing for your teacher or they're just sending you on jobs or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So that looking back, I mean, I didn't know that then. You know what I mean? Like I just came when I got here, I was like, okay, I'm just go to jam session, you know, and but I do remember and then the other yeah, I mean, and the other good thing about thinking now, man, you got me going back. You got me going back in my mind. I remember, man, I was studying with I studied a little bit with Bill Huntington when I was here,
Cool.
when I first got here, and and because of all the problems that I had at home, my bass lessons were basically counseling sessions. Talking about that whole mentor thing.
Yeah.
And he was great, man. It was great. Those are. I remember some of my studies, some of the actual technical studies that he had me working on. But what I remember the most with him was his patience with me, in that and him kind of like even consoling me, man. Like when I was, because I would talk to him about some of the problems that I had, the family problems that I had
Yeah.
at that age,
Yeah.
So that, and what else was I going to say that was really interesting about him? And I remember, I think he had been married and divorced once too. So I'm trying, but there was one other thing. I had something else on the top of my mind and kind of slip my thinking. But
When it
yeah,
comes back, we'll circle
yeah,
back to it.
yeah, yeah. But Bill was great. Bill was great in that way. Oh, but we were just talking about yeah, yeah, yeah. What to get gigs? I would say yeah. That would definitely be you know. I'd start studying with somebody that
Yeah, that's
that
great advice.
yeah. hmm
Um,
Let's see if there's anything else try to think of in that regard. Uh, I mean, yeah, and of course, sitting in, going around and you know, just introducing yourself to whomever, being humble. Like I said, it's kind of different. Like we were talking about that whole thing, like with attitudes and stuff.
yeah.
Today, I think it seems, I don't know. It's interesting, man. Like seeing, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, like, and because they have these jam sessions at the Always Lounge on Sunday sometime, and I went to a couple of them, and I mean, I don't mean I'm just gonna say what how I feel about it. I was like, man, this is not like any jam session that we used to have. It's kind of like it, it just seems that the guys during this time that I'm talking about, when I was around, in my 20s or whatever, they were so, man, it was so dedicated and so serious about learning the music. And it just doesn't seem that way to me mostly now. It seems kind of, yeah, like a lot of young cats are just kind of superficial.
Yeah.
And I'll be the first to, and I don't want to, I mean, I know I have I got a long ways to go, so I don't want to, about it to think that I'm all that, because I don't, you know what I mean? Like I know that I have a lot of practicing and learning to do, but I try to tell myself that it takes that attitude of wanting to continue to learn, right? Like every day, and
Yeah.
to humble yourself. And yeah, so anyway, yeah, those are some thoughts on that.
No, that's great. And again, I think it does come with age. I often talk about what I term as young musicians with some of the guests on the podcast, but I don't mean that in terms oh, here's an 18-year-old musician and here's a 50-year-old musician. I don't mean that. There's some guys who, they get to 35 and decide that they're going to do this full time. To me, that's a young musician. If you've never been
Right,
involved in a
right.
scene, you've still got to learn how those scenes work and stuff. And
That's
to
right.
kind of go back to your point, what I'm seeing, just from my side, and again, none of this is in any kind of condescending or dismissive way to the people listening. But what I'm seeing a lot is, and maybe it's through the social media thing to bring it back to that. I'm seeing a lot of people, they kind of have this, they need to prove that they're good straight off the bat rather than just going up there and let the music do the talking. And, again, that's each to their own. It is what it is.
Right, right. It is what it is. Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
going to segue this into an interesting kind of band politic kind of question. Again, you've been playing with lots of different musicians, and I'm sure many bands at this point in your career. Dealing with different types of personalities in bands is tough. What advice, if any, could you offer up and coming musicians, young musicians, our listeners, on trying to keep some kind of harmony within grouped ensembles?
Right, right. Well, I always say this about that subject. Remember what we're called. It's supposed to be a band.
Yeah.
People put their whatever they have their personality, whatever. You can't. You you know the whole unit has to be one. So that means that everybody has to listen to what everyone else is doing, and everyone has to be complimentary of what everyone else is doing.
Mhm.
That's a constant. That's constant and in real time. So I think for me, if you have, now don't misunderstand me. Of course, you have even you have musicians that are like have superstar musical ability, but um all of that has to be in context when you're working with other artists. I'm not really a sports person, but if you're on a basketball team or football team or whatever, one person can't do the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's a team, it's a band. So just try to remember that as you're approaching, serving the music, as well as the other musicians that are in the organization. You know,
Yeah.
so that's what I have to say about that. Yeah, it's a band. Remember, it's a band. It's not one person. If you want to do a solo gig, do a solo gig.
I had that discussion a couple days ago myself. Man, too many similar things going on in this chat.
Yeah,
um. Okay. Here's another one for you, Mitchell. I know you've done a lot of traveling. I know
yeah,
you've played at a lot of festivals all over the place with a lot of different artists and stuff. And I will list a bunch of the artists' names in the description when I put the podcast up, and I'll record an introduction post our interview. Um, but what are some of your touring survival tips? Is there anything you perhaps wish you had known when you started in regards to traveling with gear and eating on the road, trying to stay healthy, trying to stay in touch with loved ones, etc., etc.?
yeah. Those are really good questions. And there was a book, man, that I read. I can't remember. Man, there was a great book that I read years ago about that. I can't remember. But I guess I can just kind of talk from my experience. But yeah, all of those things are very important. Eating the best that you can, is very important. It's just like at home, right? You gotta. It's even more so needed when you're on the road, right? Like eating healthy, trying to maybe have some time to go to a gym when you can. How much what things you bring to travel with. How much you travel with. It's so many different dynamics. One of the things I have a partner of mine who's a great manager that actually I met. He used to be a road manager for Preservation Hall Band, and it was Michael Paz. And I tell you, man, when I started working with him, man, what I want to, I guess the comment that I want to make is having a great road manager. If you seeing the difference between having a great road manager and not is is pretty pretty important, because if you have a great road manager, they look out for a lot of those things too.
Yeah.
They look out because when you're it's so much stuff that's going on when you're on the road, right? Because you're thinking about, you gotta, of course, you're thinking about the performance, and you're always on edge about that, and want to make sure that's all straight and everything. But there's always so many moving pieces, man. You're traveling, you either cramp, maybe, I mean, you're either cramped up on a plane or in a bus for however long you got to make your drive. And it just seems like the time a lot of times just like flies away. It's either like the time goes super slow or it goes super fast. It's like, it's not, um, uh, you know, because I guess, and then maybe that's what I guess I'm trying to get to with the whole manager thing, because the manager comes in and kind of helps you to have a regular routine when you don't have to think about that. You don't have to think about a lot of things. I know that's great for my experiences being on the road, like with Paz, because for instance, like your venue might tell you, okay, the gig might be at 10 p.m. or something, and the venue might say, oh, they want you to have a 4 o'clock sound check. You know what I mean? And you just got off a flight and you just arrived at 2 o'clock or something. You know what I mean? And and if you're most of the time musicians who are not thinking in that role, they're just gonna get off the plane and they're gonna go straight to the sound check or whatever. Then they're gonna be, there waiting, sitting. They're gonna be dead tired by the time you get to the night for the concert. But if you have a great road manager, that person's gonna step in and they're gonna tell the venue, no, we're not gonna do a sound check at 4 o'clock. We'll do the sound check at whatever, it's 7, 8 o'clock or whatever. My people need to go, they need to get rest. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's
Yeah.
like, so all of the basic things that we know we need to have, like, you know, eating well, rest, exercise, some leisure time, all of those types of things. If you have a good manager, they're going to plan for all of that for you, and you don't have to, you know, really think about it, because if they're doing their job well, they're going to have all of that set up for you, and they're going to deal with all the headache. I mean, it's just so many things that could add so much stress. You get to the airport, and of course, something's going on with somebody with some luggage or the flights or whatever. You got to deal with that, and then you got to deal with hotel bookings, and because I've done all of that, and all of that's a strain on your mental health and your physical health.
And it takes time away from the plane. If you're trying to upkeep your musicianship,
Right,
suddenly
absolutely.
being on the phone for 4 hours a day, it's like,
That's right. Absolutely, it does. So it's and I mean, it's not. It's a interesting thing because when you first start off, a lot of times you're not in a position to have a manager or have an agent and so a lot of times we're doing um, many of those things ourselves. But speaking to someone from experience, I can tell you, you can burn out on that. I have done it, you know, because what happens is, like with any small business, when you're doing something good as a small business owner, be whatever the business is, then it starts to become more demand for it. And if you're doing everything, it's just more demand for you doing everything. You know what I mean? Like you're doing like, 4 or 5 different jobs, and yeah, you got a great product, but so then there becomes more demand, and then it's like, okay, well, those 4 or 5 different jobs now, each one of them times 2 or 3.
yeah.
So I don't know. Those are some thoughts that I have about that. You have to prioritize those basic things. Eating well, on time, rest. Uh, uh, how you pack, what you pack. Those types of things. But just keeping. But the other thing is just keeping all the other stress related things that can happen when you're on the road. you know, uh, yeah, this is bringing me back to a thought, man. I remember once being on the road, speaking about Paz, man. I remember being on the road with him for a gig for Preservation Hall, and it was crazy, man. It was like first we're on a bus and the bus breaks down. It was something like that. Then we had to get to the train, and then we got on the train, and and it was icy. We had to go. I remember it was a gig in New York, and we had to, and it was just like all these different crazy things that happened. But he maneuvered them, and we got to the gig and made the gig, and on time and everything, and got back. But I just thought about that, like when I was in thinking back on it after it all had transpired. I was like, wow, if you're a musician and you got to deal with all of those things and play the gig, it's maddening,
Totally kills the vibe.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, so I would say, prioritize those things, and then, when you can, as soon as you can get into a position, if you can get into a position that, you have a team, what in whatever form that might be, that helps you, can alleviate, what I mean, like some of the things, so that you don't have no added extra stress and pressure,
Yeah, totally. I know that you have like the events coordination company, the 504 experience. And I know that you do some of the things that we just spoke about. We're
Yes.
not going to go 100% into that, but what I'd like to ask is, in addition to the performing role, and in addition to running your own business, and I think I read that you've done a lot of teaching at some of the local universities and stuff like that. If I'm wrong on that, I do apologize. But um, what do you what are your thoughts on diversity and trying to do various roles within the music industry to sometimes make
R-
up the salary of what one
Right.
person would make at one job, and how do you juggle all of these things personally?
Well, I'll tell you, man, it's difficult, and I mean, I guess it's um, you know, so I guess it's a personal thing. People are gonna have different views about this, because you're gonna have, I'm sure, there, some people or maybe musicians that have the mindset, just do it. I'm a performer. That's what, and they focus on that, and they become great at that, and they do well at that. I think, and then of course there are other people who there are different aspects about the business, that you can, like as you were saying, I've kind of done my own small music booking, and I've also produced a small music festival before. And for me, I remember having actually I had that conversation with Wallace Davenport, talking about that, having that gig with him at the Mason Bar. I remember taking him to lunch, man, and asking like, Mr. Davenport, like, I'm playing bass and but I'm just not making enough money. Like, what, like, do you have any other suggestions or other things that I just kind of felt like, man, there's got to be something else that I could do. And then he started telling me, and I had never really thought about it before. He's like, well, there's so many other different aspects of the music business, different things that you could do, and that's kind of how I started kind of going on getting this whole idea about getting into booking, you know. So there's a really great book. I'll say this if it's okay
Yeah, of
for
course.
people. There's a really great book that I read I think every musician should start, especially if you're starting. It's called How to Become Your Own Booking Agent by Jerry Goldstein. I was just telling a young musician about it last night. That was the first book, and then she goes through all these different aspects of the business, and the different things that you're gonna need. And I remember, actually, can't remember how I found out about that book, but I remember getting the book and reading it, and then starting my little booking company. Just like, okay, this is what she said to do in the book. This is okay. At that time, it was, we still kind of had like record companies, and um, you could call up festivals, and you send your CDs into festivals to try to get. This was like in the '90s, try to get your act booked or whatever. But yeah, I mean, for me, I have I have done different things, because most of the time for me, early on anyway. I mean, now I have gigs all the time, but early on, I didn't, you know. So it was kind of always like, okay, well, what am I gonna do when I don't have gigs? Well, what can I do during daytime when I'm, I mean, so you know, like I said, that's a personal, I guess. It's not easy doing juggling two, three, four different things, and I don't. I would say probably. I think it's probably accurate that old saying, something to the effect of like you could probably be good at those different things, but not great at all of them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Because your focus is so split on so many different things. And I that's kind of how my career has gone. I've done a little bit of all those different things. Some of it is just kind of experimenting, see if I like this or if I like that, or but I never left the playing. That always stays with me regardless. You know, um, but yeah, you know, I could probably have certainly focused more of it. Business time that uh, I have used probably could have been focused on practicing more.
Yet you're a monster
But
musician, and I know that the 504 experience has done pretty well from what I read. So you've done very well for yourself, my friend.
well, I've stayed busy. I'll say that.
Yeah, yeah,
I've
yeah.
stayed
There's
busy.
no doubt about that. I mean, anybody who
Yeah,
wants to check out Mitchell, I'll put some links in the show notes. But he's a very busy man from what
yeah,
the internet says.
yeah,
Mitch,
yeah.
I have one last. Well, I suppose it's a two-part question, but one last question for you.
Yeah.
What do you think has been the best piece of advice you've ever received in both relation to your musicality and in relation to your career?
Ooh, okay. The best uh advice. Oh man.
It's a loaded one. I should have given you a
Yeah,
heads
I
up.
never
I put
really.
everyone on the spot with this guy.
Yeah, I never really thought about that.
I suppose even if it wasn't given to you, what's something you've maybe learnt along the way that you think, man, had I
Mhm,
known,
yeah.
I could have
Well,
done A, B, and C.
well, I'll just tell you. I think one of the best things that you can do is, and I think I kind of spoke a little bit to this earlier, but is being humble and being, in the mind of a constant learner. You know, because if you can have that type of mindset, you can probably work your way just about through any and every situation. You know, um, and you can gain, you can gain from it, continue on your journey.
That's great, man.
I think that's really important, and especially for young musicians. You know, I mean, for any musician, for any person.
Yeah.
How you treat people. You know, just sometimes we say common sense, but sometimes we say, well, common sense is not too common, not too common. But
That's very
yeah,
true.
yeah, yeah, and yeah. So that's it. That's one other thing that keeps coming back to my mind. A couple of things that I wanted to share that I thought about earlier. I didn't get to say, but a couple of things that Mark Bro is a great trumpeter here. He comes from a musical family here, and I never forget a couple of things that he said to me. One was, "There ain't no age on the bandstand," and that's what you said early, what you spoke to earlier about you could be a 35-year-old learner, right, a beginner.
Yeah.
There ain't no age on the bandstand, and he said that uh, New Orleans music is a feeling,
It's very
and
true.
it is very true. And I think about those things from time to time. Off doing whatever I'm doing. Yeah. So I don't know. I hope this was. this helped. I hope this helps someone.
It's all helpful. And I'm a
Yeah.
big believer in sort of conclusion here. To go back to your last answer, I personally am a massive advocate for there's information in everything. There's knowledge in
Right.
everything. So if you do
That's
keep
right.
an open mind, like you've just said, even if you feel like, what typically happens, I know because at this point I've interviewed dozens of people for this podcast. And what typically happens is I'll get a message, later today or maybe in a week going, man, I thought of this thing I could have said. And you gotta
Right.
go, that's normal. That's human nature. But the beauty
Right.
of the real time conversation here is it kind of goes full circle with a lot of the things we've spoken about today. It's like we're having a real conversation with real people who are working musicians who,
Right.
if you just are patient enough, and I know we're living in a bit of an impatient world now, but if you're patient enough to listen, there's tips throughout our conversation that most people could pick up if they keep an open mind.
I agree with that.
All right, Mitchell Player, thank you so very much for your time. It was marvelous talking to you. I can't wait to come and watch you play, and I will link your links in the show notes so people know when to come and see you and where they can come and see you. Thank you so much for your time, my friend.
Thank you, Travis. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Appreciate that, man. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Sweet. There we go. I want to thank Mitchell so much for his time. I want to thank each and every one of you who listened for your time. As mentioned at the top of the show, please leave us a rating and review. Share this with your musician friends or up-and-coming musician friends. It helps us and it really doesn't cost anything to do, so please do us a solid. My name is Travis Mark. You can find out more about me at travismark.com. You can find out more about the Musician's Mentor at musicians-mentor.com. Keep working, keep pushing, keep practicing, keep getting better. Try and get better by 1% every day, people. Your future self will thank you. Until next time, peace.